The snow crunched beneath Sarah's boots as she stumbled through the dense Alaskan forest, her pregnant belly making every step a challenge. She'd been hiking for hours, completely lost, when a bone-chilling howl echoed through the trees. Following the sound, she discovered something that made her heart stop. A wolf, unlike any she'd ever seen, easily twice the size of normal wolves, trapped in a cruel steel snare that was cutting deep into its leg. Most people would have run, but Sarah wasn't most people. As a former wildlife veterinarian who'd spent years treating injured animals before her pregnancy, she recognized the intelligence burning in those amber eyes. This wasn't just any wolf. There was something almost mystical about the creature's presence. The massive animal watched her approach, not with aggression, but with an eerie calm that sent shivers down her spine. With her medical kit in hand and her unborn child kicking restlessly, Sarah faced an impossible choice: free this potentially dangerous predator and risk everything, or walk away and let it die. But what she didn't know was that this decision would awaken a connection between human and wolf that hadn't been seen for centuries. What ancient secret was this wolf hiding, and how would it change Sarah's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah knelt in the snow, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air as she studied the magnificent creature before her. The wolf's silver-grey coat shimmered with an otherworldly quality, and its amber eyes seemed to hold depths of wisdom she couldn't comprehend. Blood had soaked into the pristine snow around the trap, creating a stark crimson circle that made her veterinary instincts surge forward. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, slowly setting down her medical kit. The wolf's massive head tilted slightly at the sound of her voice, ears twitching with what almost seemed like understanding. Sarah had never encountered an animal that radiated such presence. It was as if she were in the company of something far more than mere wildlife. Her baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick to her ribs, causing her to wince and place a protective hand over her rounded belly. The wolf's gaze immediately shifted to her movement, and for a heartbeat, Sarah could have sworn she saw concern flicker across its features. Impossible, she told herself. Wolves didn't express human emotions, no matter how intelligent they appeared. The steel trap was a cruel piece of work, illegal in this region, and designed to cause maximum damage. Sarah's jaw clenched as she examined the mechanism. Whoever had set this had no regard for the suffering it would cause. The metal teeth had bitten deep into the wolf's right hind leg, but thankfully hadn't reached the bone. Still, infection was a serious risk, especially out here in the wilderness where temperatures dropped dangerously low after sunset. "I'm going to help you," she murmured, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "But you need to trust me, okay? This is going to hurt." The wolf made a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. It sounded almost like acknowledgement, which sent another chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. In all her years treating wild animals, she'd never encountered anything like this. Sarah positioned herself carefully, mindful of her pregnancy, as she examined the trap's release mechanism. These particular snares required simultaneous pressure on two springs while pulling the jaws apart, a task that normally required two people. With the wolf's leg caught between the steel teeth, she'd have to work with surgical precision to avoid causing additional trauma. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them in ghostly spirals. Sarah realized with growing concern that she'd been lost for nearly 6 hours now. The short Alaskan winter day was fading, and she'd need to find shelter soon or risk hypothermia, a dangerous prospect for both her and her unborn child. But she couldn't abandon this magnificent creature to die a slow, agonizing death. As she positioned her hands on the trap's springs, the wolf did something extraordinary. It stretched its massive head forward and gently nuzzled her gloved hand, a gesture so tender and human-like that tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. The touch sent an odd tingling sensation up her arm, warm and electric, completely at odds with the freezing temperature. "You're not just any wolf, are you?" she whispered, meeting those intelligent amber eyes. The creature held her gaze with an intensity that made her heart race. There were stories among the Alaskan natives about spirit wolves, guardians of the wilderness who appeared only in times of great need. Sarah had always dismissed such tales as folklore, but now, faced with this extraordinary being, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Taking a deep breath, she pressed down on the springs simultaneously, feeling the mechanism give way beneath the pressure. The wolf remained perfectly still, as if understanding that any movement could result in further injury. With careful precision, Sarah began to work the steel jaws apart, preparing to free the creature that would change her life forever. The wolf's golden eyes tracked Sarah's every movement as she approached, amber orbs that seemed to hold centuries of ancient wisdom. Blood matted the thick silver-grey fur around the steel trap, and she could see the creature's flanks rising and falling with labored breaths. Despite its obvious pain, the wolf remained eerily still, as if it understood that this human meant no harm. Sarah knelt slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. "Easy there, beautiful," she whispered, her veterinary instincts overriding her fear. "I'm going to help you." The trap was a vicious thing, an illegal leg-hold snare that should have been banned from these lands decades ago. Whoever had set it clearly didn't care about conservation laws or the suffering of wildlife. Sarah's jaw tightened with anger as she examined the mechanism, noting how the serrated edges had bitten deep into the wolf's front leg. She reached into her medical kit, grateful she'd packed thoroughly for the expedition. The wolf watched her movements but made no sound, not even a whimper. It was unsettling how intelligent those eyes appeared, as if the creature was assessing her just as carefully as she was assessing its injuries. "You're magnificent," Sarah breathed, pulling out a sedative. "Probably close to 200 pounds. A male, I'd guess." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but it remained motionless. As she prepared the injection, a strange sensation washed over her, a tingling warmth that started in her chest and spread outward. The baby kicked strongly, more active than it had been in weeks. Sarah paused, her hand resting on her rounded belly. The wolf's gaze dropped to her midsection, and she could have sworn she saw something shift in those golden depths. Understanding, recognition, connection. "This is going to help with the pain," she said softly, administering the sedative into the wolf's haunch. The needle slid in easily, and the wolf didn't even flinch. Within minutes, its breathing deepened, and its massive head settled onto the pine needles. Working quickly, Sarah examined the trap's mechanism. The release lever was buried under the wolf's leg, making extraction tricky. She would need to shift the animal's position without causing more damage to the injured limb. The wound was deep, but had missed the major bone. Lucky, considering the trap's brutal design. As she worked to free the wolf, Sarah found herself talking to the unconscious creature. "You know, I never planned to be here. 3 months ago, I was running a wildlife clinic in Fairbanks, thinking I'd take a nice, safe desk job before the baby came." She grunted as she maneuvered the heavy trap. "But Marcus insisted I come on this survey, said it would be my last chance for fieldwork." The trap gave slightly and she adjusted her grip. "He's probably worried sick right now. My husband, he's a good man, but he doesn't understand why I need to be out here, why I can't just be content with domestic animals and regular hours." With a sharp click, the trap released. Sarah carefully lifted the wolf's leg free, her hands gentle as she examined the damage. The wounds were clean but deep, requiring sutures. As she cleaned the injuries with antiseptic, the wolf's eyes fluttered open, still hazy from the sedative, but alert enough to watch her work. "Almost done," she murmured, threading her needle. The sutures went in smoothly, her experienced hands working with practiced precision. Throughout the procedure, the wolf remained perfectly still, as if it truly understood she was helping. As Sarah applied the final bandage, something extraordinary happened. The wolf lifted its great head and gently touched its nose to her belly. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that moment, Sarah felt a surge of warmth and energy that took her breath away. The baby responded immediately, pressing against her ribs as if reaching toward the wolf's touch. "What was that?" she whispered, but the wolf had already pulled back, studying her with those impossibly knowing eyes. The sedative was wearing off. Sarah could see alertness returning to the wolf's gaze, and she knew she should back away, give the creature space to recover and leave. But something held her there, kneeling in the fading afternoon light beside this magnificent predator. "You're going to be fine," she said quietly. "The leg will heal. Just keep the bandage dry for a few days." The wolf shifted, testing its weight on the injured limb. It favored the leg but could bear weight, a good sign. Slowly, the massive creature rose to its feet, towering over Sarah even in her kneeling position. For a moment that stretched between heartbeats, human and wolf regarded each other in perfect silence. Then the wolf did something that defied everything Sarah knew about wild animal behavior. It stepped forward and pressed its forehead gently against hers, a gesture so intimate and deliberate that tears sprang to her eyes. When it pulled away and disappeared into the darkening forest without a sound, Sarah remained kneeling in the pine needles, her hand on her belly, wondering if she had just experienced something that changed everything. The wolf's golden eyes tracked Sarah's every movement as she approached, each step deliberate and slow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but years of working with wild animals had taught her to project calm even when terror coursed through her veins. The massive creature's breathing was labored, foam flecking its dark muzzle, and she could see the cruel steel jaws of the trap buried deep in its left hind leg. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to pick up through the pines. "I'm going to help you." The wolf's ears flattened against its skull, a low rumble emanating from deep in its chest. Sarah froze, recognizing the warning. She was close enough now to see the intricate patterns in its thick coat, not the typical grey of most Alaskan wolves, but an unusual silver-black that seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight. This was no ordinary wolf. Its sheer size alone suggested something different, something ancient. Sarah slowly lowered herself to her knees, making herself smaller and less threatening. The movement sent a sharp reminder through her lower back that she was carrying precious cargo of her own. At 5 months pregnant, every position was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but she pushed the discomfort aside. This magnificent creature needed her expertise. From her pack, she retrieved a small vial of ketamine and a syringe. The sedative would take the edge off the wolf's pain and panic, making the removal safer for both of them. But as she prepared the injection, something extraordinary happened. The wolf stopped growling. Its golden eyes, eyes that seemed far too intelligent, far too knowing, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, Sarah felt something shift in the air between them, as if an invisible thread had suddenly pulled taut. The sensation was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, a warmth that spread from her chest outward, encompassing both her and the trapped animal in what she could only describe as understanding. "You know I'm trying to help," she said softly, and could have sworn she saw the wolf nod almost imperceptibly. Moving with renewed confidence, Sarah approached the trap. It was a brutal piece of equipment, clearly homemade and designed to cause maximum damage. Rage flared in her chest at the cruelty of it. These kinds of traps had been illegal in Alaska for decades, yet someone had deliberately set this monstrosity in an area where wolves were known to travel. The wolf remained still as she examined the mechanism, though she could see the tremors of pain running through its powerful frame. The trap had been triggered hours ago, maybe longer, and infection was already a concern. But what struck her most was the animal's behavior. No wild wolf should be this calm with a human so close, injured or not. "This is going to hurt," she warned, her hands finding the release springs on either side of the trap. The wolf's eyes never left her face, and again she felt that strange warmth, that sense of connection that defied rational explanation. She pressed both springs simultaneously. The steel jaws opened with a sharp clang, and the wolf immediately pulled its leg free. Sarah expected it to bolt, to disappear into the forest as quickly as its injury would allow. Instead, it remained where it was, watching her with those unsettling golden eyes. The wound was worse than she'd hoped, but not as bad as she'd feared. Deep puncture wounds on both sides of the leg, significant swelling, and definitely some muscle damage, but the bone appeared intact. She could work with this. "I need to clean this," she said, speaking to the wolf as she would any patient. "And you're going to need antibiotics." As if it understood every word, the wolf shifted its position slightly, extending the injured leg toward her. Sarah's hands stilled. In 15 years of veterinary medicine, she had never encountered behavior like this from a wild animal. It was as if the creature was actively cooperating in its own treatment. Working quickly but gently, she cleaned the wounds with antiseptic, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped the leg in waterproof bandaging. Throughout the entire process, the wolf remained perfectly still, though she could feel its eyes on her constantly. When she injected the antibiotic, it barely flinched. As she packed away her supplies, the wolf slowly rose to its feet. It was even more imposing standing, easily the largest wolf she'd ever seen, with a presence that seemed to command the very forest around them. It took a tentative step, testing the bandaged leg, then turned those remarkable eyes back to her. Sarah stood as well, her lower back protesting, and for a long moment woman and wolf simply regarded each other. The connection she felt was undeniable now, thrumming through her like a second heartbeat. Whatever this was, whatever had just happened between them, it was only the beginning. The wolf took another step, then another, moving deeper into the forest. But instead of disappearing, it paused and looked back at her, as if waiting. Sarah glanced around at the unfamiliar landscape, at the lengthening shadows that reminded her she was hopelessly lost. When she looked back, the wolf was still watching her. It wanted her to follow. The wolf's amber eyes tracked Sarah's every movement as she knelt beside the trap, her veterinary bag spread open on the frost-covered ground. Steam rose from the animal's panting breath in the frigid air, creating ghostly wisps between them. The massive creature lay still, but she could sense the coiled tension in its muscles, the barely contained wildness that could explode into violence at any moment. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind whistling through the spruce trees. "I'm going to help you." The trap was a brutal piece of craftsmanship, heavy steel jaws designed to hold something much larger than even this magnificent wolf. Sarah had seen similar devices confiscated from poachers, but never one this size. Her stomach churned as she examined the mechanism, noting the custom modifications that made it even more vicious than standard leg-hold traps. The wolf's right hind leg was caught just above the paw, the steel teeth having penetrated through thick fur and into muscle. Blood had frozen in dark crystals around the wound, and she could see the telltale signs of circulation loss in the trapped limb. Without immediate intervention, the wolf would lose the leg if it survived at all. Sarah pulled on her surgical gloves, wincing as the baby shifted restlessly inside her. At 6 months pregnant, every movement required more effort than she was accustomed to, but her hands remained steady as she prepared a syringe with a mild sedative. The wolf needed to be calm but conscious. Full anesthesia in these conditions could prove fatal. As she approached with the needle, the wolf's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. Sarah froze, meeting those ancient eyes with her own. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then something extraordinary happened. The wolf's expression shifted, the aggression fading into what could only be described as understanding. "You know I'm trying to help," Sarah breathed, amazed. She'd worked with countless wild animals, but she'd never experienced such clear communication without words. The injection went smoothly, the wolf remaining motionless as the sedative took effect. Sarah watched its breathing slow to a more manageable rhythm, though those keen eyes never left her face. Working quickly, she examined the trap's release mechanism, grateful for the emergency courses she'd taken years ago on wildlife rescue techniques. The spring-loaded jaws were held closed by a series of pressure plates. Sarah would need to compress all of them simultaneously, while maintaining enough leverage to pry the trap open. It was a two-person job at minimum, but she was utterly alone in the vast wilderness with only her determination and a trapped wolf for company. She positioned her tools carefully, a pair of heavy-duty pliers, a small crowbar from her emergency kit, and a surgical retractor that might provide just enough additional pressure. The wolf watched her preparations with what seemed like patient interest, occasionally shifting its weight, but never struggling against the trap. "Okay, here we go," Sarah murmured, positioning herself for maximum leverage. The baby kicked sharply, as if protesting the awkward angle, but she gritted her teeth and began applying pressure to the release mechanism. The trap fought her every inch of the way. Her muscles strained against the unyielding steel, sweat beading on her forehead despite the sub-zero temperature. Just when she thought she might have to give up, to seek help that might arrive too late, she felt the first pressure plate give way with a metallic click. Encouraged, Sarah repositioned her tools and pressed harder. A second plate released, then a third. The wolf remained perfectly still, somehow sensing that any movement could disrupt the delicate process. Sarah felt a strange connection to the animal, as if they were working together despite the obvious impossibility of such cooperation. The final pressure plate resisted her efforts with stubborn determination. Sarah's arms trembled with exhaustion, her pregnancy making the physical demands nearly unbearable. But as she looked into the wolf's eyes, she saw something that made her dig deeper, a trust so profound it took her breath away. With a final surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah compressed the last plate. The trap's jaws sprang open with a sharp crack that echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The wolf immediately pulled its injured leg free, dark blood staining the snow. Sarah quickly moved to examine the wound, expecting the animal to bolt now that it was free. Instead, the wolf remained where it was, allowing her to clean and bandage the deep lacerations with antiseptic and surgical dressing from her kit. As she worked, Sarah became aware of an odd sensation, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. It felt almost like recognition, as if she were greeting an old friend rather than treating a wild predator. The baby seemed to sense it too, moving gently rather than kicking, settling into peaceful stillness. When the bandaging was complete, Sarah sat back on her heels and looked at her unlikely patient. The wolf regarded her with what could only be described as gratitude, its massive head tilting slightly in an almost human gesture of acknowledgement. The massive wolf's golden eyes tracked Sarah's every movement as she approached with the makeshift splint. Each step through the snow felt weighted with consequence, as if crossing some invisible threshold between worlds. Her veterinary training warred with an inexplicable sense that this was no ordinary rescue. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. "I'm going to help you." The wolf's lips curled back slightly, revealing ivory fangs, but the growl that emerged was more warning than threat. Sarah had worked with enough wild animals to recognize the difference between aggression and fear-based defensiveness. This creature was assessing her, calculating risk with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. She knelt in the snow 3 feet away, close enough to work, but far enough to retreat if needed. The trap's steel jaws had closed around the wolf's right rear leg, just above the ankle. Dark blood stained the pristine snow, and she could see where the metal had bitten through fur and flesh. But what struck her most was the trap itself. This wasn't some rusty relic left by forgotten trappers. The steel gleamed with recent manufacture, and the chain was new, anchored to a deliberately placed stake. Someone had set this trap recently. Someone who knew these mountains. "This is going to hurt," Sarah murmured, reaching for the trap's release mechanism. "But I need you to trust me." The moment her fingers touched the steel, the wolf's entire body went rigid. Not with pain, with something else entirely. The golden eyes widened, pupils dilating, and a low whine escaped its throat. Sarah felt it too, a shock that ran from her fingertips up through her arms, settling somewhere deep in her chest, like a warm stone. Images flashed unbidden through her mind, snow-covered peaks under starlight, the howl of a pack echoing across frozen valleys, a sense of running, of powerful muscles carrying her across vast distances with effortless grace, and underneath it all, an overwhelming feeling of recognition, as if she were meeting not a stranger but someone she'd been searching for her entire life. Sarah jerked her hands back, gasping. The wolf watched her with what could only be described as knowing patience, as if it had expected this moment, had been waiting for it. "What are you?" she breathed. The baby stirred in her womb, a gentle flutter that reminded her why she was here, lost in these mountains with a storm approaching. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling her daughter's movement, and made a decision that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the certainty blooming in her chest. She grasped the trap's springs firmly, ignoring the strange tingling that shot through her palms. The mechanism was designed to be operated by human hands, and she'd dealt with similar devices before. What she hadn't expected was the wolf's immediate stillness, as if it understood exactly what she was doing and had chosen to cooperate completely. The springs compressed with a metallic groan. Blood rushed back into the freed limb, and the wolf's breath hitched in pain, but it didn't move, didn't snap at her hands so close to its muzzle. Instead, those golden eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, seen in a way that went beyond the physical. Sarah pulled the trap away and immediately began examining the wound. The metal had created deep punctures on both sides of the leg, and she could feel heat radiating from the swollen tissue. Infection was already setting in, which meant this trap had been set at least 2 days ago. "I need to clean this," she explained, as if the wolf could understand every word. Perhaps it could. She'd given up trying to rationalize what was happening here. Using snow and the small bottle of antiseptic from her pack, she gently cleaned the wounds. The wolf remained motionless throughout the process, though she could see the effort it took in the tension of its muscles, the way its breathing stayed carefully controlled. When she began wrapping the injured leg with strips torn from her spare shirt, creating a protective barrier before applying the splint, the wolf actually shifted position to give her better access. "There," Sarah said as she secured the final binding, "that should hold until you can get proper care." The wolf tested its weight tentatively on the splinted leg. It could bear some pressure, though it clearly favored the limb. As it struggled to stand, Sarah found herself offering support, her hands buried in thick silver fur that seemed to spark with warmth beneath her touch. They stood together in the gathering dusk, woman and wolf, both breathing hard from the effort and something far more profound. The storm clouds had moved closer while she worked, and the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall. The wolf took a step away, then stopped, looking back at her with unmistakable invitation. Sarah glanced at her GPS device. Still no signal. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she could hear the wind picking up in the trees above them. The wolf waited, patient as the mountains themselves. The wolf's eyes never left Sarah's face as she knelt beside the trap, her fingers working methodically to understand its mechanism. The steel jaws had bitten deep into the animal's left hind leg, just above the paw, and dried blood matted the dark fur around the wound. What struck her most wasn't the severity of the injury, but the wolf's unnatural stillness. No whimpering, no struggling, just that intense, almost human gaze watching her every movement. "Easy, beautiful," she whispered, her veterinary training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. "I know it hurts, but we're going to get you out of this." The trap was military grade, far more sophisticated than anything a typical poacher might use. Heavy springs flanked both sides of the steel jaws, and Sarah realized she'd need to compress both simultaneously to release the mechanism. Her pregnancy made the awkward positioning even more challenging, but she managed to brace herself against a fallen log and get the leverage she needed. As her hands found purchase on the first spring, the wolf made a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something that seemed almost like communication. Sarah paused, studying the creature's face. Intelligence burned in those amber eyes, an awareness that made her skin prickle with something beyond fear or wonder. "You understand, don't you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "You know I'm trying to help." The wolf's ears twitched forward, and impossibly it seemed to nod. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Wolves were intelligent animals, certainly, but this level of comprehension bordered on the impossible. She pressed down on the first spring, feeling the resistance of the steel mechanism. Her muscles strained against the weight, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold air. The second spring proved even more difficult. Sarah had to shift her position, practically lying across the trap to reach it properly. The wolf remained motionless throughout her maneuvering, though she could see pain flicker across its features when her movements jostled the injured leg. "Almost there," she panted, applying steady pressure to both springs simultaneously. The trap mechanism groaned in protest, steel grinding against steel. Sarah's arms burned with effort, and for a terrifying moment she thought she might not have the strength to complete the task. Then something extraordinary happened. The wolf lifted its free paw and placed it deliberately over Sarah's hands, adding its weight to her leverage. The additional pressure was exactly what she needed. The springs compressed fully, and the jaws of the trap sprang open with a metallic clang. The wolf immediately pulled its injured leg free, but instead of fleeing into the forest, it remained beside Sarah, who sat back on her heels, breathing heavily from the exertion. She stared at the magnificent animal, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The wolf had actively participated in its own rescue, demonstrating not just intelligence but cooperation that defied everything she knew about wild animal behavior. "That shouldn't have been possible," she murmured, reaching instinctively toward the injured leg. The wolf didn't flinch away from her touch, allowing her to examine the wound with gentle fingers. The damage was significant but not life-threatening. Deep puncture wounds and some torn muscle, but no broken bones that she could detect. As she worked, Sarah became aware of a strange sensation building in her chest, a warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The feeling intensified when her hands made contact with the wolf's fur, as if some invisible current was flowing between them. The baby in her womb began to move more actively than ever before, responding to whatever energy was building around them. The wolf's breathing had synchronized with her own, and when Sarah looked up, she found those amber eyes fixed on her belly. Without warning, the animal lowered its massive head and gently nuzzled her pregnant abdomen. The touch was so tender, so deliberate, that tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "What are you?" she whispered. In response, the wolf raised its head and released a long, haunting howl that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. The sound wrapped around Sarah like a physical thing, resonating not just in her ears, but in her blood, her soul. Other howls answered from the distant forest, a pack calling back to their member perhaps, or something far more ancient responding to an ageless summons. As the echoes faded, Sarah felt fundamentally changed, though she couldn't articulate how or why. The connection she'd felt with this creature went beyond anything in her scientific understanding, touching something primal and instinctual that her rational mind couldn't categorize. The wolf struggled to its feet, favoring the injured leg, but clearly mobile. It took a few careful steps, testing its weight distribution, then turned back to Sarah with what could only be described as gratitude shining in its eyes. Then, with fluid grace despite its injury, the massive animal melted back into the forest, leaving Sarah alone with the sprung trap and the growing certainty that her life would never be the same. The wolf's golden eyes tracked her every movement as Maya prepared the makeshift splint from strips of her flannel shirt and fallen branches. Her hands trembled, whether from cold, exhaustion, or the surreal nature of what she was attempting, she couldn't say. The massive creature lay still, its breathing shallow but steady, trusting her in a way that defied everything she knew about wild predators. "Easy, boy," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely certain of the wolf's gender from this angle. "This is going to hurt, but I need to stabilize that leg before we can get you out of here." The wolf's ears twitched at her voice, and impossibly it seemed to understand. When she gently lifted the injured limb, the animal remained motionless despite what must have been excruciating pain. Maya had sedated countless wild animals in her practice, but she'd never experienced such cooperation from a conscious predator. As she worked, wrapping the splint with practiced efficiency, strange images flickered at the edges of her vision. Snow-covered mountains under starlight, a pack running through ancient forests, the scent of pine and earth so vivid it made her dizzy. She blinked hard, attributing the hallucinations to her own deteriorating condition. "There," she said, securing the final knot. "That should hold until—" A low rumble interrupted her words, not from the injured wolf, but from somewhere in the darkening forest around them. Maya's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound. Other wolves, and they were close. The wolf beneath her hands lifted its massive head, releasing a haunting howl that seemed to vibrate through Maya's very bones. The forest fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted with answering calls from multiple directions. They were surrounded. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her baby seemed to flutter in response to her spiking adrenaline. She had no weapon, no shelter, nowhere to run. Her only ally was a severely injured predator who, despite their strange connection, was still very much a wild animal. Golden eyes emerged from the twilight gloom. First one pair, then another, then 5 more. The pack moved like liquid shadow, flowing between the trees with deadly grace. Maya pressed herself against a large pine, trying to make herself as small as possible while staying close to her patient. The alpha approached first, a magnificent black wolf whose shoulders came nearly to Maya's waist. Its pale eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. This was no ordinary predator. This was a creature that had survived countless harsh winters, that commanded absolute respect from its pack. To her amazement, the injured wolf struggled to its feet, balancing awkwardly on 3 legs while keeping the splinted limb elevated. It positioned itself between Maya and the approaching pack, hackles raised despite its obvious pain. The alpha's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth like ivory daggers. The wounded wolf responded with a deep growl that Maya felt in her chest. What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to last forever, but probably spanned only seconds. Then something extraordinary happened. The alpha's posture shifted, its head tilting as it studied Maya with what looked almost like curiosity. It approached slowly, deliberately, until it stood close enough that she could feel its warm breath on her face. Maya held perfectly still as the massive predator sniffed her carefully, her hair, her clothes, her hands that still smelled of the other wolf's blood. The alpha's examination paused at her belly. Its nostrils flared, and Maya realized with a shock that it could smell the changes in her body, could detect the life growing within her. The wolf's expression, if such a thing could be attributed to an animal, seemed almost reverent. When the alpha finally stepped back, it released a low whine that was answered immediately by the injured wolf. Some form of communication passed between them, a conversation in a language Maya couldn't understand, but somehow felt in her bones. The pack began to move, forming a loose circle around Maya and her patient. Rather than threatening, their formation felt protective, as if they were standing guard. The alpha approached the injured wolf, gently nuzzling its neck before examining Maya's splint work with what appeared to be approval. As darkness settled over the forest, the wolves lay down in the snow, creating a living windbreak around Maya. The injured wolf settled beside her, its massive body radiating warmth that she desperately needed. Despite every logical instinct screaming that this was impossible, Maya found herself leaning against the wolf's thick fur. The baby kicked gently, as if sensing safety in this most unlikely sanctuary. Maya closed her eyes, listening to the quiet breathing of the pack around her, and tried to process what was happening. She was lost in the Alaskan wilderness, pregnant and running out of time, yet somehow she felt safer than she had since leaving the clinic that morning. The injured wolf's breathing gradually deepened into sleep, but its body remained alert, ready to respond to any threat. Maya matched her breathing to its steady rhythm and allowed herself to hope that tomorrow might bring answers to this impossible mystery. The wolf's breathing had grown labored during the night, each exhale creating small clouds in the frigid air. Sarah pressed her palm against his flank, feeling the heat radiating through his thick fur. The infection was spreading faster than she'd hoped, and her limited supply of antibiotics wouldn't be enough to fight it off completely. She'd fashioned a crude shelter using fallen branches and her emergency tarp, creating a windbreak that protected them both from the worst of the mountain gusts. The wolf hadn't tried to leave, though whether from weakness or choice, she couldn't be certain. Every few hours, he would lift his massive head and fix those intelligent amber eyes on her face, as if studying her intentions. "I know you don't trust me yet," she murmured, checking the bandage around his injured leg. "But we're going to get through this together." The trap had done significant damage. 3 deep puncture wounds that had torn through muscle and scraped bone. In her clinic, this would have required surgery, proper anesthesia, sterile conditions. Here, she was working with whatever supplies she could salvage from her pack and whatever knowledge she could pull from years of field experience. As dawn broke over the ridge, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, Sarah felt a familiar flutter in her abdomen. The baby was active this morning, responding perhaps to her elevated stress levels. She placed a protective hand over her belly and tried to project calm she didn't feel. The wolf's ears suddenly perked forward, swiveling toward a sound she couldn't yet detect. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing impressive canines, but the growl that rumbled in his chest seemed more warning than aggression. Sarah froze, following his gaze toward the tree line below their shelter. 3 figures emerged from the forest, moving with the confident stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized the lead man's distinctive red jacket, the same color she'd glimpsed through the trees yesterday before finding the trap. "Easy," she whispered to the wolf, whose hackles had risen along his spine. "Stay quiet." But these weren't ordinary hunters or trappers. As they drew closer, Sarah could see they carried equipment she didn't recognize, some kind of electronic devices that beeped steadily as they swept them back and forth across the ground. The lead man stopped directly below their position and spoke into a radio. "Signal's strongest here. Whatever we're tracking is close." Sarah's blood chilled. They weren't just hunting the wolf, they were tracking him, which meant this wasn't a random encounter with poachers. This was something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. The wolf seemed to understand the threat as clearly as she did. Despite his injuries, he rose slowly to his feet, positioning himself between Sarah and the men below. The movement sent a sharp pang through her chest. This magnificent creature, weakened by infection and barely able to stand, was still trying to protect her. "We need to move," she breathed, beginning to gather her supplies as quietly as possible. The electronic beeping grew louder. The men were climbing toward their position, following whatever signal their devices were detecting. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Was it some kind of tracking collar she hadn't noticed? But she'd examined every inch of the wolf's body while treating his wounds. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. The trap itself had been the tracker, designed not just to capture, but to signal the wolf's location, which meant these men had been monitoring it remotely, waiting for their prize to be caught. "They're not here to rescue you," she whispered to the wolf. "They're here to take you." The wolf's response was immediate and decisive. Despite his limp, he moved toward her and nudged her firmly toward the back of their shelter, away from the approaching men. When she hesitated, confused by his behavior, he grasped the sleeve of her jacket, gently between his teeth, and tugged. Sarah's scientific mind struggled to process what was happening. Wolves were intelligent, certainly, but this level of understanding and protective behavior toward a human was unprecedented in all her years of studying wildlife behavior. A shout from below made the decision for her. The men had found their shelter. "There, fresh tracks, and something's been camping here." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and followed the wolf as he led her along a narrow ledge she hadn't noticed in the darkness. Her boots slipped on loose scree, and for a terrifying moment she teetered at the edge of a steep drop. The wolf immediately pressed against her side, steadying her, his amber eyes meeting hers with unmistakable communication. "Trust me." Behind them, she could hear the men scrambling up the slope, their voices growing closer. The electronic beeping had become a steady whine. Whatever they were tracking, they were definitely on the right trail. The wolf guided her around an outcropping of rock that concealed them from view just as the first pursuer reached their abandoned shelter. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone, one hand on her belly, the other resting on the wolf's shoulders, and tried to become invisible. The morning brought a crystalline silence that seemed to magnify every breath, every heartbeat. Sarah woke to find Kodiak's massive form curled protectively around her makeshift shelter, his silver-grey fur dusted with fresh snow that had fallen during the night. The sight should have terrified her, waking beside a creature that could crush her skull with a single bite, but instead she felt safer than she had in days. The wolf's eyes opened as she stirred, those impossible amber orbs tracking her movement with an intelligence that made her chest tighten. She could swear she saw concern there, though she knew her pregnancy hormones might be making her imagine things that weren't real. Or were they? "Good morning," she whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. Kodiak's ears twitched forward, and he made a soft rumbling sound deep in his chest. Not quite a growl, more like acknowledgement. Her stomach cramped with hunger, sharp and insistent. The energy bars were long gone, and her body was demanding nourishment not just for herself but for the life growing within her. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the subtle roundness that had become more pronounced over the past few days of stress and exertion. Kodiak rose to his feet in one fluid motion, snow cascading from his thick coat. He padded a few steps away, then turned back to look at her expectantly. When she didn't move, he approached and gently grasped her sleeve in his teeth, tugging with surprising delicacy. "You want me to follow you?" Sarah pushed herself upright, her muscles protesting after another night on the hard ground. The wolf released her sleeve and began walking toward a dense cluster of spruce trees, pausing every few steps to ensure she was behind him. They moved through the forest in single file, Kodiak breaking trail through snow that would have been knee-deep for Sarah. She found herself studying the way he moved, the perfect economy of motion, the way he tested each step before committing his full weight. Everything about him spoke of adaptation, of belonging to this harsh landscape in a way she never could. After 20 minutes of steady walking, Kodiak stopped beside a fallen log and began pawing at something buried in the snow. Sarah approached cautiously and gasped when she saw what he had uncovered, a cache of food carefully wrapped in what looked like oiled leather. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the bundle, revealing strips of dried meat, some kind of preserved fish, and what appeared to be a mixture of berries and nuts. "How did you—" She looked up at Kodiak, who was watching her with that unsettling intelligence. The rational part of her mind insisted this was coincidence, that someone had left supplies here and the wolf had simply remembered the location, but the deeper, more primitive part of her brain whispered that something else was happening here, something beyond her understanding. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Kodiak sat nearby like a sentinel. The protein helped clear the fog from her thoughts, and she began to notice details she had missed before. The cache had been carefully constructed to keep moisture out and predators away, except for one predator who seemed to know exactly where it was hidden. As she ate, memories surfaced unbidden. Her grandmother's stories about the old ways, about connections between humans and animals that went deeper than domestication or training. Her scientific mind had always dismissed these as folklore, but sitting here in the wilderness with this massive wolf as her guardian, she found her certainty wavering. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, different from the hunger cramps. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her belly as worry flooded through her. The stress, the cold, the physical demands. How much could her body take before something went wrong? Kodiak was beside her instantly, his warm bulk pressing against her side. The pain faded, but the fear remained. She needed to get back to civilization, needed proper medical care. But the landmarks she had tried to follow yesterday meant nothing to her now, and her compass seemed to spin lazily without settling on any definite direction. "I don't know where I am," she whispered, the admission tearing something loose inside her chest. "I don't know how to get home." Kodiak's response was immediate, a soft whine that sounded almost like sympathy. He moved to stand in front of her, those amber eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he did something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the natural world. He placed his massive paw gently on her belly, the weight warm and oddly comforting. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she felt connected to something vast and ancient, something that spoke of bonds forged in starlight and sealed with trust deeper than words. When he pulled away and began walking purposefully toward the northeast, Sarah didn't hesitate to follow. The wolf's golden eyes held Sarah's gaze as she approached with careful, deliberate steps. 3 days had passed since she'd freed him from the trap, and still he remained nearby, as if drawn by some invisible tether. The morning mist clung to the forest floor, creating an ethereal backdrop for their strange companionship. "You should go," she whispered, settling onto a fallen log 20 feet away. "Your pack must be looking for you." The massive creature tilted his head, ears pricked forward. Sarah named him Kodiak in her mind, though she'd never spoken it aloud. Something about his presence felt ancient, older than the towering spruces that surrounded them. When he looked at her, she sensed an intelligence that went beyond normal animal instinct. Her hand moved instinctively to her growing belly. The baby had been active this morning, tiny feet drumming against her ribs as if responding to the crisp mountain air. She was 16 weeks along now, and despite the impossible circumstances, both she and the child seemed to be thriving in this wilderness. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the peaceful silence. Sarah tensed, recognizing the heavy, careless tread of boots through underbrush. Kodiak's hackles rose instantly, a low growl rumbling from his chest. "Well, well, look what we have here." 3 men emerged from the tree line, each carrying rifles. The leader, a grizzled man with cold grey eyes, wore a satisfied smirk that made Sarah's skin crawl. She recognized the type immediately. Poachers who saw the wilderness as nothing more than a resource to exploit. "That's a fine specimen," the man continued, raising his weapon. "Bet his pelt would fetch a good price down south." "There are laws protecting wolves in this region," Sarah said, standing slowly. Her veterinary training kicked in, the same calm authority she used with frightened animals now directed at these dangerous men. The leader laughed harshly. "Laws? Lady, we're 50 miles from the nearest ranger station. Ain't nobody gonna find you or that wolf out here." Kodiak stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the hunters. The fur along his spine stood rigid, and his lips pulled back to reveal formidable fangs. But Sarah could see the slight limp from his injured leg, the way he favored his left side. He was still healing, still vulnerable. "Easy, boy," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing the wolf or trying to calm her own racing heart. The hunters spread out, attempting to flank them. Sarah's mind raced, calculating distances and possibilities. The men were armed and clearly experienced, but they were also overconfident. They saw a pregnant woman and an injured wolf as easy targets. What happened next defied everything Sarah thought she knew about the natural world. Kodiak threw back his head and released a howl that seemed to shake the very mountains. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, echoing off canyon walls and reverberating through the forest. But it was more than a call, it was a summons. The response came swiftly. First one answering howl, then another, then a chorus that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The hunters' expressions shifted from confidence to concern as the sounds grew closer. "Relax, boys," the leader said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "It's just noise. Wolves are cowards when faced with rifles." But Sarah felt something else stirring. The baby in her womb began moving with unprecedented energy, as if responding to some primal frequency. Her hands tingled where they'd touched Kodiak's wounds, and suddenly she could sense what he sensed: the approaching pack, their loyalty and protective fury, their ancient connection to this sacred land. The first wolf appeared like a shadow made manifest, sliding silently between the trees, then another and another. Within moments, the hunters found themselves surrounded by 8 magnificent creatures, each one larger and more formidable than anything they'd expected to encounter. "This ain't natural," one of the men whispered, his rifle trembling in his hands. Sarah realized he was right. This wasn't ordinary wolf behavior. Packs didn't typically respond this quickly or coordinate this effectively with an injured member. Something deeper was at work here, something that connected her to these creatures in ways she was only beginning to understand. The alpha female of the pack emerged from behind a massive pine, her silver-grey coat gleaming in the filtered sunlight. She approached Kodiak with obvious affection, nuzzling his muzzle before turning her piercing blue gaze on Sarah. In that moment, Sarah felt a recognition pass between them, female to female, protector to protector. The hunters began backing away, their earlier bravado evaporating as they found themselves outmaneuvered by predators far more intelligent and coordinated than they'd anticipated. "This isn't over," the leader snarled, but his retreat was already begun. As the men disappeared into the forest, Sarah remained motionless among the pack. The wolves showed no fear of her presence, treating her as if she belonged. Kodiak moved closer, his warm breath visible in the cool air as he studied her with those ancient, knowing eyes. Something had changed in the forest that morning, something that would alter the course of both their destinies. The storm arrived with a vengeance just after dawn, transforming the wilderness into a whirling chaos of snow and wind. Maya pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, her makeshift shelter barely holding against the gale. Beside her, the great wolf lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. She'd managed to clean and dress his wounds through the night, working by the dim light of her dying flashlight, but infection was her greatest fear now. The baby kicked restlessly inside her, responding to her elevated stress. Maya placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering soft reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. Their food was nearly gone. Her radio remained silent, and now this blizzard threatened to bury them alive. Through the howling wind, she heard something that made her blood freeze, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The injured wolf's ears perked up, and he lifted his massive head with obvious effort, his yellow eyes fixed on something Maya couldn't see through the swirling snow. The howling came again, closer this time, and Maya realized with growing wonder that it wasn't just one voice but many. A pack was approaching, and given the territorial nature of wolves, she wasn't sure if that meant rescue or doom for her wounded companion. The first shadow emerged from the white curtain like a ghost made flesh. A silver-grey female, smaller than Maya's wolf but radiating an undeniable authority. Behind her came others. A massive black male with scarred flanks, a russet-colored younger wolf, and several others whose forms flickered in and out of visibility through the storm. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She'd studied wolf behavior extensively, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The pack approached with an almost reverent caution, their usual dominance hierarchies seeming to dissolve in the presence of her injured companion. The silver female stepped forward first, lowering her head to touch noses with the wounded wolf. The gesture was so gentle, so filled with what could only be called love, that Maya felt tears freeze on her cheeks. The other wolves followed suit, each offering their own form of greeting and comfort, but what happened next defied everything Maya thought she knew about the natural world. The black male turned his attention to her, and Maya found herself looking into eyes that held an intelligence far beyond animal instinct. Slowly, deliberately, he approached and lowered himself to the ground beside her injured wolf. positioning his body to create an additional windbreak. The others followed his lead, forming a living wall against the storm. The russet wolf disappeared into the blizzard and returned minutes later with a rabbit clenched in her jaws. She dropped it at Maya's feet, then stepped back with what looked unmistakably like expectation. Maya stared at the offering, her scientific mind reeling. Wolves didn't share food with humans. They certainly didn't hunt for them. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. As if her voice had been a signal, the silver female moved closer. Maya held perfectly still as the wolf sniffed delicately at her extended hand, then at her swollen belly. The wolf's ears pricked forward with what Maya could only interpret as curiosity and concern. The storm raged for hours, but within the protective circle of wolves, Maya felt safer than she had since becoming lost. She managed to start a small fire using dry tinder from her pack and cook the rabbit. The smell of meat seemed to rouse her wounded wolf, and she carefully fed him small pieces, encouraged when he managed to keep them down. As the day wore on, something extraordinary began to happen. The wolves started to communicate with her, not through words obviously, but through gestures, positioning and expressions, so clear they might as well have been speaking. When she shivered, they moved closer. When the baby kicked strongly enough to make her gasp, they watched with protective attention. The silver female seemed particularly attuned to Maya's condition. When Maya struggled to find a comfortable position against the rocks, the wolf positioned herself as a living backrest. When Maya's water ran low, two of the younger wolves vanished into the storm and returned with chunks of clean snow. Most remarkable of all was their treatment of the injured male. They groomed his wounds with the same careful attention Maya had shown, their tongues cleaning away infection with a precision that spoke of ancient wisdom. Under their ministrations, he seemed to grow stronger. As night fell and the storm finally began to abate, Maya found herself surrounded by sleeping wolves, their combined body heat creating a cocoon of warmth. The injured male's head rested across her lap, his breathing deep and regular. She stroked his thick fur, marveling at the trust these magnificent creatures had shown her. In the distance, she could hear helicopter rotors cutting through the clearing air. Her rescue was coming, but as she looked around at her unlikely guardians, Maya realized she was no longer the same person who had set that trap days ago. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the world, and there would be no going back. The aurora danced overhead in ribbons of emerald and gold as Maya pressed deeper into the wilderness, the massive wolf padding silently beside her. 3 days had passed since their escape from the poachers' camp, and she could feel the ancient bond between them growing stronger with each mile. The wolf, whom she'd begun calling Kodiak, seemed to understand her thoughts before she voiced them, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that defied explanation. Her pregnancy made every step a challenge, but the wolf's presence filled her with an inexplicable energy. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, he would press close, his warmth radiating through her body like a healing current. The baby responded to his proximity too, moving more actively when Kodiak was near, as if recognizing something profound in the connection. They had been following an ancient trail that seemed to exist only when viewed from the corner of her eye. Stone markers worn smooth by countless seasons, barely visible scratches on trees that might have been territorial markings or something far older. Kodiak moved with purpose along this path, occasionally pausing to lift his massive head and test the air before continuing with renewed certainty. As dawn approached, they crested a ridge that revealed a sight that stole Maya's breath. Below them stretched a hidden valley, untouched and pristine, where a crystal-clear lake reflected the snow-capped peaks like a perfect mirror. But it wasn't the natural beauty that made her heart race. It was the structure rising from the lake's center. An ancient stone platform connected to the shore by a narrow causeway seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Carved pillars surrounded a central altar, where symbols she couldn't read spiraled upward like frozen smoke. The entire scene thrummed with power that made her skin tingle and the baby kick with unprecedented vigor. "What is this place?" she whispered. Kodiak looked up at her, and for a moment his eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. He began descending toward the valley, his pace quickening as they approached the lake's edge. Maya followed, her scientific mind warring with something deeper that urged her forward. At the causeway's beginning, ancient stones formed words in a language she somehow understood, where spirit meets flesh, where wild meets tame, where two become one eternal flame. The inscription sent chills down her spine, but Kodiak was already padding across the narrow bridge, turning back to ensure she followed. Each step onto the platform intensified the sensation of power flowing through her. The carved symbols began to glow with soft blue light, responding to their presence. Kodiak moved to the altar's center and lay down, his massive form perfectly fitting a wolf-shaped depression in the stone that she hadn't noticed before. "You knew," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "You knew we'd come here." The wolf's eyes closed, and suddenly Maya felt herself drawn into a vision more vivid than any dream. She saw herself as if from above, a lone figure standing on an ancient platform while aurora light spiraled down from the heavens. But she wasn't alone. Kodiak's spirit form stood beside her, no longer bound by physical limitations, his true size revealed as magnificent and terrible. In the vision, she watched her hands move to rest on her swollen belly as streams of light flowed between her, the wolf, and the child within. The baby's spirit blazed like a small sun, and she understood with crystal clarity that this moment had been destined long before her birth, perhaps long before her grandmother's birth. The light intensified, and she saw flashes of what was to come, herself leading others to protect the wilderness, Kodiak at her side as guardian and guide. She saw the child grown, possessing gifts that bridged human and wild in ways the world desperately needed. She saw herself speaking to councils of people, her words carrying the authority of one who had touched the source of all living things. But with understanding came choice. She could turn away, return to her old life, pretend this had never happened, or she could accept what she was being offered, a bond that would change her forever, responsibilities that would reshape her existence, power that came with profound obligations. The baby kicked hard, as if voting for the future that called to them both. Maya stepped forward and placed her hands on Kodiak's massive head. The moment their connection completed, light exploded around them, not harsh but encompassing, like being embraced by the essence of life itself. She felt the wolf's memories flooding through her, centuries of watching over these lands, waiting for the human who could share his burden and multiply his strength. When the light faded, she remained standing on the platform, but everything had changed. She could feel every living thing in the valley, from the smallest lichen to the great bears in their dens. Kodiak rose, his eyes now glowing with the same inner light she could feel pulsing within herself. They were no longer separate beings sharing a journey. They had become something new, something the world would desperately need in the trials ahead. The aurora borealis painted the sky in emerald ribbons as Sarah crouched beside the injured wolf, her breath forming crystals in the frigid air. 3 days had passed since she'd freed him from the cruel steel trap, and their strange partnership had evolved into something she couldn't quite comprehend. The massive grey wolf, whom she'd begun calling Storm for his silver-streaked coat, seemed to understand her pregnancy in ways that defied explanation. He positioned himself between her and the wind, his thick fur providing a windbreak when she needed to rest. When her back ached from the weight of her growing belly, he would settle beside her, his warm presence easing the tension in her muscles. Most remarkably, he led her to food sources she never would have found alone, cached supplies from abandoned hunting camps, winter berries buried beneath snow, even a small cabin stocked with emergency rations. "You're not like other wolves, are you?" Sarah whispered, running her fingers through his coarse fur. Storm's amber eyes held an intelligence that made her question everything she thought she knew about wildlife behavior. When she spoke, his ears would perk forward with an attentiveness that suggested comprehension beyond mere sound recognition. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs, and Storm's head immediately turned toward her belly. He whined softly, a sound of concern that made Sarah's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She was 6 months along now, and the pregnancy was becoming harder to ignore despite her desperate circumstances. "We need to find civilization soon," she murmured, though part of her wondered if Storm would disappear the moment they encountered other humans. The thought filled her with an inexplicable sadness. Storm rose abruptly, his hackles raised as he sniffed the air. Sarah followed his gaze across the moonlit landscape and saw what had captured his attention. Fresh tracks in the snow, too large and too deep to belong to any animal. Someone else was out here. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing across the frozen valley. "Is anyone there?" Storm growled low in his throat, positioning himself protectively in front of her. His reaction sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. If Storm was wary of these tracks, perhaps she should be too. They followed the trail cautiously, Storm's nose constantly working the scent. The tracks led to a cluster of weathered buildings half buried in snow, some kind of abandoned mining operation from decades past. Smoke rose from one of the structures, and Sarah's heart leaped at the prospect of warmth and human contact. But Storm refused to move closer. He sat firmly in the snow, blocking her path with his massive frame. When she tried to step around him, he gently but firmly pushed her back with his shoulder. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. "There are people there. They could help us." A voice carried across the clearing, rough, angry, definitely human. Sarah strained to make out the words, but the distance and wind made it impossible. Storm's growl deepened, and suddenly Sarah understood. These weren't rescuers. They were the trappers. Her blood chilled as she remembered the cruel steel jaws that had nearly cost Storm his leg. These men had set those traps, had left them scattered throughout the wilderness to maim and kill indiscriminately. They wouldn't welcome a pregnant veterinarian who could report their illegal activities. "Thank you," she breathed into Storm's ear. His tail swished once in acknowledgement. They circled wide around the mining camp, but not before Sarah caught sight of several men loading gear into snow machines. Their faces were hard, their movements aggressive. One of them kicked at something in the snow, another trap, she realized with revulsion. As they put distance between themselves and the trappers, Sarah felt the baby shift restlessly in her womb. The stress was affecting both of them. She needed medical attention, proper nutrition, a warm place to rest, but not at the cost of falling into the hands of men who viewed the wilderness as their personal hunting ground. Storm led her to a sheltered grove where the northern lights danced overhead like celestial spirits. As she settled against a fallen log, he disappeared into the darkness. Sarah's heart clenched with fear that he'd abandoned her, but he returned within an hour carrying something in his massive jaws, a dead rabbit, still warm. "I can't eat that raw," she protested weakly, but Storm was already gathering dry twigs in his mouth, arranging them in a pile. Sarah stared in amazement as he continued building what could only be described as a fire pit. "This is impossible," she whispered, but she pulled out her waterproof matches anyway. The fire caught easily, and soon she was roasting the rabbit meat over the flames while Storm watched with satisfaction. As she ate, Sarah studied her unlikely protector. Whatever Storm was, wolf, spirit guide, or something else entirely, he was keeping her alive in ways that transcended normal animal behavior. The ancient stories her grandmother used to tell about shapeshifters and guardian spirits suddenly didn't seem quite so fantastical. The baby kicked gently as if settling down for sleep, and Storm curled himself around Sarah's back like a living blanket. In the dancing firelight, his eyes held secrets as old as the wilderness itself. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like ghostly fingers as Sarah followed Kodiak through the dense undergrowth. Each step felt heavier now, her swollen belly making navigation through the wilderness increasingly difficult. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing the tension that radiated from both her and the massive wolf leading their small procession. 3 days had passed since they'd encountered the hunting party, and the memory of those cold, calculating eyes still sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Marcus Blackwood's men were still out there somewhere, tracking them with a persistence that spoke of more than mere bounty hunting. There was something personal in their pursuit, something that made Kodiak's hackles rise whenever the wind carried their distant scent. "We need to find shelter," Sarah whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Her supplies were running dangerously low, and the physical demands of their journey were taking their toll. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly sharp kick to her ribs, making her gasp and stumble. Kodiak immediately turned, his golden eyes filled with concern. The wolf had become increasingly protective as her pregnancy advanced, often positioning himself between her and any perceived threat. Now he approached slowly, his massive head lowering to gently nuzzle her hand. The touch triggered another flash of shared sensation, not quite a vision this time, but something deeper. She felt his worry as acutely as her own, experienced his fierce determination to protect both her and her unborn child. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, creating an almost telepathic connection that both amazed and frightened her. "I'm okay," she murmured, scratching behind his ears, "just tired." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew they were only partially true. The strange symptoms that had begun weeks ago were intensifying. Her senses had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. She could smell the musk of a bear from miles away, hear the heartbeat of a rabbit hidden in the brush, feel the subtle vibrations of approaching weather systems through the soles of her feet. Most unsettling of all were the dreams. Each night brought visions of ancient forests and ceremonies conducted under starlit skies, of women who looked remarkably like her, standing alongside wolves in perfect harmony. The dreams felt like memories, though she knew they couldn't be her own. A sharp crack in the distance made both of them freeze. Kodiak's ears pricked forward, and Sarah felt his muscles tense beneath her palm. The sound came again, definitely footsteps, and definitely human. Without hesitation, Kodiak began moving toward a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural shelter. Sarah followed as quickly as her condition allowed, her heart hammering against her ribs. They reached the hiding spot just as voices became audible through the trees. "The tracks lead this way," a gruff voice called out. Sarah recognized it immediately. Thompson, Blackwood's lead tracker. "They're close, real close." "About time," another voice replied. "Blackwood's getting impatient. He wants that wolf alive, and he wants the woman brought back unharmed." Sarah's blood ran cold. Why would they specifically want her unharmed? What did Blackwood know about her connection to Kodiak? Crouched behind the rocks, she placed a protective hand over her belly as the baby shifted restlessly. Kodiak pressed against her side, his warmth steadying her frayed nerves. Through their bond, she could feel him calculating distances and escape routes, his predator's mind already planning their next move. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the metallic clink of equipment. Sarah held her breath as shadows moved past their hiding place, counting at least 4 distinct figures. These weren't ordinary hunters. They moved with military precision, their gear suggesting they were prepared for a prolonged chase. "Check those rocks," Thompson ordered. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Beside her, Kodiak's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, his body coiled like a spring ready to unleash. She could feel his protective instincts warring with the knowledge that a fight would endanger her and the baby. Footsteps approached their shelter. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on the strange new awareness that had been growing within her, reaching out with senses she was only beginning to understand. Suddenly, she felt them, a family of ravens roosting in a nearby tree, their sharp intelligence alert to the human intrusion below. Without fully understanding how she did it, Sarah reached out to those avian minds, sharing her desperation and need. The response was immediate and startling. The sky erupted in a cacophony of harsh cries as dozens of ravens took flight at once, their black wings creating chaos as they dove and swooped around the hunters. Shouts of confusion and alarm filled the air as the men stumbled backward, swatting at the aggressive birds. "What the hell?" Thompson's curse was cut short as a particularly large raven tangled itself in his equipment. In the confusion, Kodiak nudged Sarah urgently toward a narrow gap between the boulders. Understanding immediately, she squeezed through the opening, following the wolf as he led her away from their pursuers. Behind them, the ravens continued their assault, buying precious time for their escape. As they disappeared deeper into the wilderness, Sarah marveled at what had just happened. The connection wasn't just with Kodiak anymore. It was expanding, growing into something far more profound than she had ever imagined possible. The ancient grove pulsed with ethereal light as Maya pressed her palm against the heart tree's silver bark. The moment her skin made contact, visions flooded her consciousness, centuries of guardians who had stood in this very spot, their lives intertwining with the wolves they protected. She saw the Covenant's true nature, not a burden, but a sacred partnership that had kept the wilderness in balance for generations. Kavik stood beside her, his massive form radiating warmth and strength. Through their bond, she felt his memories too, the long lineage of alpha wolves who had chosen their human counterparts generation after generation, maintaining the delicate equilibrium between civilization and the wild. "The poachers," Maya whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "They're not just after wolves. They know about the grove." The tree's luminescence intensified, showing her fragments of recent events. Marcus Holloway's operation extended far beyond illegal hunting. He was part of a consortium that had discovered references to the Heart Grove in old mining surveys, recognizing its significance to indigenous legends. They sought to exploit whatever made this place special, even if it meant destroying the ancient protections. Kavik's low growl rumbled through the clearing as he sensed the same visions. His pack emerged from the shadows, a dozen wolves of varying sizes, their eyes reflecting the grove's supernatural glow. Maya had never seen them all together before, and their combined presence was both humbling and empowering. Through her connection to the heart tree, Maya understood that the grove existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was physically rooted in the Alaskan wilderness, but it also served as a nexus point where the natural world's consciousness converged. The wolves weren't just guardians of territory, they were protectors of something far more profound. Her baby kicked strongly, and Maya gasped as she realized the child was responding to the grove's energy. The new life within her wasn't just her daughter, it was the next guardian, already attuned to the ancient magic. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but Kavik pressed against her side, offering silent support. A distant sound made them all freeze. Helicopter rotors echoed through the valley, their mechanical noise a jarring contrast to the grove's mystical atmosphere. Maya's enhanced senses, sharpened by her bond with Kavik, detected multiple aircraft approaching from different directions. "They found us," she said, though she wasn't entirely surprised. Holloway had resources and determination, and her escape from his men had likely only intensified his pursuit. The heart tree's visions shifted, showing her possible futures. In some, the grove fell to chainsaws and machinery, its power harvested and commodified until nothing remained but scarred earth. In others, the ancient balance held, but only through great sacrifice. One vision made her breath catch. She saw herself years from now, her daughter grown, both of them running alongside a pack that included Kavik's descendants. But first, they had to survive the present. Kavik's pack spread out through the grove, taking defensive positions among the luminescent trees. Maya marveled at their coordination. This wasn't just animal instinct, but strategic thinking enhanced by the grove's collective consciousness. Each wolf knew exactly where to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. The helicopters were closer now, and Maya could hear voices shouting over the rotor noise. Holloway's men were fast roping down into the valley, armed and dangerous. But as they entered the grove's perimeter, something unexpected happened. The trees themselves seemed to resist the intrusion. Branches that had been still in the windless grove suddenly began to sway and tangle, creating obstacles where none had existed moments before. The ground became treacherous, with roots rising to trip unwary feet. The grove was defending itself, but Maya sensed it needed a focal point, a guardian to direct its protective instincts. She stepped away from the heart tree, feeling the connection stretch but not break. Kavik moved to her left side while two other wolves flanked her right. Together, they walked toward the grove's edge where Holloway's men were struggling through the increasingly hostile terrain. "Stop!" Maya called out, her voice carrying unusual authority. "You don't understand what you're threatening." Marcus Holloway himself emerged from behind a cluster of his men, his expensive outdoor gear looking absurdly out of place in the mystical grove. His face showed a mixture of greed and fear as he took in the scene, the glowing trees, the wolves standing protectively around Maya, and the palpable sense of ancient power. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice attempting confidence but betraying underlying uncertainty. "You've led us quite a chase, but this ends now. That wolf, this place, it's all coming with us." Maya felt the grove's energy flowing through her, connecting her not just to Kavik but to every living thing in the wilderness around them. Her child moved within her, and she placed one hand protectively over her belly, while the other rested on Kavik's massive head. "No," she said simply, and the word carried the weight of centuries. "It doesn't." The helicopter's rotors cut through the crisp morning air as Sarah pressed her face to the window, scanning the endless expanse of wilderness below. 3 days had passed since she'd left the ancient grove, and despite the GPS coordinates she'd provided, the search teams had found nothing but empty forest where the sacred space should have been. "There," she pointed to a clearing ahead. "That's where I first found him." The pilot nodded, bringing them down in the same meadow where her journey had begun weeks ago. As the rotors wound down, Sarah stepped onto the familiar ground, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. The baby had been unusually active since they'd entered this region, as if responding to some unseen energy in the landscape. Dr. Martinez emerged from the aircraft, medical bag in hand. "Sarah, you shouldn't be out here in your condition. The trauma you've experienced—" "I'm fine, Elena. Better than fine." Sarah's voice carried a conviction that made her colleague pause. "I need to find him." The search team spread out across the meadow, their movements efficient but somehow too loud, too intrusive for this sacred place. Sarah closed her eyes, reaching for the connection that had sustained her through those transformative days. At first, there was nothing, just the ordinary sounds of wind through pine and distant bird calls. Then she felt it, a familiar presence, watching from the tree line. Her eyes snapped open, and there he stood. Fenris emerged from the shadows between the ancient spruces, his silver coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight. But he was different now, larger somehow, more substantial, as if the ritual had awakened something primal within his very essence. His yellow eyes met hers across the distance, and Sarah felt the bond between them pulse with warmth. The search team members reached for their equipment, voices rising in excitement, but Sarah raised her hand. "No," she said firmly. "No tranquilizers, no nets. He's not here as a captive." Fenris padded forward, his massive paws silent on the forest floor. Several team members stepped back instinctively. He was enormous, far larger than any wolf should be, his presence commanding a respect that bordered on reverence. When he reached Sarah, he lowered his great head, and she placed her hands on either side of his muzzle. In that touch, images flooded her mind. She saw the pack, dozens of wolves moving through the wilderness with purpose, their numbers growing. She saw damaged ecosystems beginning to heal, streams running clearer, forests growing stronger. She saw herself in a cabin at the edge of the wilderness, a child playing safely in a garden while Fenris and his pack maintained their ancient vigil nearby. "The preserve," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "You're showing me the preserve." Dr. Martinez approached cautiously. "Sarah, what preserve?" Sarah kept her hands on Fenris, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her palms. "There's a way to do this right. Not capture, not relocation. Partnership." She looked up at her colleague, her eyes bright with possibility. "What if we could establish a research station here? a place where we could study the pack's natural behaviors while ensuring their protection. The logistics alone would be manageable, Sarah interrupted. With the right backing, the right team. Think about it, Elena. A true wildlife sanctuary, where the animals remain wild but protected, where we can learn from them, instead of simply studying them. As if responding to her words, the forest around them began to stir. Shapes moved in the shadows, other wolves, stepping forward just enough to be seen before melting back into the wilderness. The message was clear: they were not alone, and they were not afraid. Fenris lifted his head, his gaze moving to Sarah's belly. Gently, almost reverently, he pressed his nose to her rounded abdomen. The baby responded immediately, a series of strong kicks that made Sarah gasp with surprise and joy. "Even the little one knows," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "This is where we belong." The helicopter pilot shifted nervously. "Ma-em, we should head back before the weather turns." Sarah nodded reluctantly, but as she prepared to leave, Fenris moved to block her path. In his eyes, she saw a promise. This was not goodbye. The bond between them had transcended the physical world, becoming something deeper, more permanent. He would be here when she returned, and she would return. She pressed her forehead to his one last time, feeling the ancient magic flow between them. "I'll be back," she whispered, "with everything we need to make this work." As they lifted off, Sarah watched Fenris grow smaller below, but the connection between them remained strong, unbroken by distance. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling her child's excited movements, and smiled through her tears. The real work was just beginning. The aurora borealis painted the sky in brilliant greens and purples as Sarah crested the final ridge, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. Below her stretched the valley where her truck waited, a tiny speck of civilization in the vast wilderness that had become her crucible. Beside her, Kodiak moved with fluid grace despite his healing leg, his massive form a living shadow against the snow. 3 weeks. That's how long they'd been together in this frozen cathedral of spruce and stone. 3 weeks since she'd freed him from the steel jaws that would have claimed his life. Now, as they descended toward the inevitable parting, Sarah felt each step like a physical wound. The wolf paused frequently, his golden eyes studying her with an intelligence that still took her breath away. During their shared ordeal, surviving the blizzard, finding shelter, hunting together when her meager supplies ran out, she'd learned to read his expressions as clearly as words. Right now, those eyes held the same reluctance that was tearing at her heart. "I know," she whispered, her gloved hand resting on his broad head. "I don't want this to end either." The baby kicked sharply, as if responding to her distress. At 7 months pregnant, she'd somehow managed to not only survive but thrive in conditions that should have killed her. The protein from Kodiak's successful hunts, the warmth of his massive body during the coldest nights, the sense of purpose that came from caring for another living being, all of it had sustained her in ways she was only beginning to understand. But she was still human, and the baby would need a hospital, doctors, the safety that only civilization could provide. As they approached the truck, Sarah's satellite phone, retrieved from the glove compartment, crackled to life with delayed messages. Her supervisor's voice, tight with worry, search and rescue coordinates. Her sister in Seattle crying into the voicemail about coming to Alaska to look for her, the normal world, calling her back. She turned to find Kodiak sitting in the snow, watching her with those impossibly expressive eyes. In the dancing light of the aurora, she could swear she saw tears on his muzzle. "The bond we share," she said softly, kneeling beside him despite her protruding belly. "It's real, isn't it? Not just some survival fantasy my mind created." He whined softly, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Then, surprising her, he pressed his massive head against her stomach. The baby immediately responded, kicking repeatedly against her ribs. Kodiak's tail wagged once, a subtle acknowledgement of the life within her that he'd helped protect. Sarah buried her face in his thick fur, breathing in his wild scent one last time. "You saved us both," she whispered. "My daughter. She'll grow up knowing about you, about what real courage looks like." When she pulled back, Kodiak was watching her intently. Then he did something that nearly broke her heart. He carefully took her wrist in his massive jaws, so gently she barely felt the pressure. It was the same gesture he'd used to guide her to safety during the worst of the blizzard, but now it felt like a promise. "You're not saying goodbye," she realized, wonder creeping into her voice. "You're saying, until we meet again." He released her wrist and touched his nose to her forehead, a blessing, a benediction, a bond that transcended species. The truck started on the second try, despite 3 weeks of sitting in sub-zero temperatures. As Sarah adjusted the mirrors and checked her supplies, she caught sight of Kodiak in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved from where she'd left him, a majestic statue silhouetted against the cosmic light show above. She drove slowly at first, unwilling to put distance between them too quickly. When she finally stopped looking back, he was gone, vanished into the wilderness as if he'd never existed at all. But the warmth in her chest told her otherwise. The strange certainty that she'd been changed on a cellular level, that something fundamental in her DNA had been awakened by their connection. As she navigated the treacherous mountain roads by aurora light, one hand resting protectively on her belly, she felt rather than knew that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The baby kicked again, and Sarah smiled through her tears. "Your first friend," she told her unborn daughter, "and he'll be watching over you, little one. Always." Behind her, carried on the Arctic wind, came the sound she'd been hoping for, a long, mournful howl that seemed to contain all the wilderness wisdom of the North. It was a farewell, a promise, and a love song all wrapped into one perfect note that would echo in her dreams for the rest of her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, her hand resting on her rounded belly. 3 months had passed since that transformative night when she and Kodiak had faced down the poachers, and the wilderness around her cabin had become something far more than home. It had become sanctuary. A familiar presence stirred in her consciousness, warm and reassuring. Through their bond, she felt Kodiak approaching before she saw him emerge from the tree line, his silver-grey coat gleaming in the early light. Behind him padded his pack, 7 magnificent wolves who had accepted Sarah as one of their own in ways she was still learning to understand. "The helicopter will be here soon," she said aloud, though she knew he already sensed her mixture of anticipation and reluctance. Today marked another milestone, her first return to civilization since choosing to stay in the wilderness. Kodiak moved to her side, his massive frame radiating calm strength. Through their connection, she felt his understanding. The monthly supply runs had become routine, but this trip was different. Dr. Helena Reeves, her former supervisor, was flying in personally to check on both Sarah and her unusual living situation. The distant thrum of rotors echoed across the valley, and Sarah watched as the familiar red and white helicopter crested the mountain ridge. As it settled onto the cleared landing area she'd prepared, she saw Helena's face through the cockpit window, a mixture of professional concern and barely contained curiosity. Helena stepped down from the aircraft, her city boots immediately sinking into the snow. She was bundled in expedition gear that looked fresh from the catalogue, a stark contrast to Sarah's worn but practical clothing that bore the marks of wilderness living. "Sarah," Helena breathed, her eyes taking in the transformation of her former colleague. "You look incredible." And Sarah knew she did. The wilderness had changed her in visible ways, her skin bronzed by mountain sun and wind, her movements more fluid and confident, her eyes holding depths they'd never possessed in her former life. But the most remarkable change was invisible, the constant presence of the wolf consciousness that had intertwined with her own. "Thank you for coming all this way," Sarah said, embracing her mentor. "There's so much I want to show you." As if summoned, Kodiak emerged from where he'd been waiting at the forest's edge. Helena's breath caught, her hand instinctively moving toward the tranquilizer gun at her hip, a gesture born of years of wildlife management protocol. "Helena, no," Sarah said gently, placing a restraining hand on her arm. "This is Kodiak. He's the reason I'm alive." The massive wolf approached slowly, his yellow eyes fixed on Helena with intelligent assessment. Sarah felt his evaluation through their bond. He was reading Helena's intentions, her fear, her genuine care for Sarah's welfare. "The reports were true then," Helena whispered. "You've actually bonded with him." "It's more than that," Sarah replied, watching as Kodiak settled beside her, his presence immediately calming. "We've discovered something extraordinary here, Helena. Something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the relationship between humans and wolves." Over the next several hours, Sarah demonstrated the incredible partnership she'd developed with the pack. She showed Helena how they worked together to monitor the vast wilderness territory, how Kodiak's enhanced senses combined with her scientific knowledge to track migration patterns, identify environmental threats, and protect the delicate ecosystem. Helena documented everything with scientific thoroughness, but Sarah could see the wonder growing in her mentor's eyes. When one of the younger wolves approached and allowed Helena to examine a healing wound Sarah had treated, the older veterinarian's professional skepticism finally crumbled. "This is unprecedented," Helena murmured, her hands gentle as she checked the wolf's recovery. "The trust level, the cooperation, it's like nothing in the literature." "Because it's never existed before," Sarah explained. "What happened between Kodiak and me that night, it created something new, a bridge between our species that I'm still trying to understand." As the day progressed, Helena witnessed the pack's intelligence and Sarah's integration into their social structure. She watched Sarah communicate through subtle body language and shared consciousness, saw how the wolves brought her information about threats or injuries within their territory. But perhaps most remarkably, Helena observed how the unborn child seemed to be part of this extraordinary bond. She watched Kodiak's protective behavior intensify whenever Sarah showed signs of fatigue, saw how the entire pack had adjusted their territorial patterns to create a safe corridor around the cabin. "The baby," Helena said quietly as they prepared her departure. "Do you know what this might mean for the child?" Sarah's hand moved to her belly, where new life grew under the protection of both human medicine and ancient wolf wisdom. "I believe she'll be born into a world where the barriers between species are already dissolved. She'll know things we're only beginning to learn." As Helena's helicopter lifted off into the afternoon sky, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The last ties to her former life had been honored and blessed. Now she could fully embrace the extraordinary future that awaited, not just for herself and Kodiak, but for the new life that would soon join their unprecedented family. The wilderness stretched endlessly before them, full of mystery and promise.